What if the story of human civilization doesn't begin where we think it does? What if 5,000 years ago, in the deserts of ancient Iraq, people weren't inventing civilization for the first time? What if they were desperately trying to remember it? Tonight, we're going to explore a possibility that changes everything. That beneath the sands and under hundreds of feet of ocean water, there lies evidence of a world that came before. A world that knew things, that built things, that understood the stars and the mathematics of time. A world that was completely erased. And the Sumerians, the people we call the first civilization, weren't the beginning at all. They were the survivors. The ones who remembered just enough to start again. Before we explore these mysteries together, I would love to know where you are. Leave a comment with your location and the current time. It is wonderful to know that this story is being followed simultaneously around the world, in different time zones, but on the same quiet night. And if you find this story interesting, please subscribe. We will be together on the journey to explore the mysterious stories of this world. Now, take a deep breath. Let your mind be still. Let the present fade. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Sudden Appearance. The year is 1849. Southern Mesopotamia. Modern-day Iraq. A team of European archaeologists stands in the desert heat, surrounded by strange mounds rising from the flat landscape. The locals call these mounds tells. Ancient garbage heaps, they assume. Centuries of wind-blown sand piled up over nothing important. But when the shovels bite into the first tell, they don't find garbage. They find walls. Massive walls made of baked brick. And beneath those walls, more walls. And beneath those, even more. Layer after layer of human construction, compressed by time into artificial hills. The archaeologists have discovered something that will fundamentally challenge our understanding of human history. They found the Sumerians. And immediately, something doesn't add up. When you excavate most ancient sites, you find a progression. Simple structures at the bottom, crude pottery, basic tools. Then, as you move up through the layers, things get more sophisticated. Better construction, finer crafts, more complex organization. It's evolution in action. Humans learning, experimenting, improving over generations. But in Sumer, that pattern doesn't exist. At the very bottom layers, the oldest levels, dating to around 3,500 years before the Common Era, they find sophistication, planned cities with grid layouts, advanced irrigation systems, monumental architecture, and writing. Actual writing, not primitive scratches or simple pictograms. Full cuneiform script capable of expressing complex ideas. It's as if someone flipped a switch. Darkness. Then suddenly, light. No gradual brightening. No transition. Just instant illumination. The archaeologists keep digging, looking for the earlier phases. The primitive villages that must have come before the cities. The simple farming settlements where people first figured out agriculture. The stages of development that logically must exist. They never find them. Or if those stages exist, they're buried so deep, so far back in time, that they might as well not exist at all. Sumer appears in the archaeological record like a flower blooming overnight. Fully formed, fully functional, sophisticated from day one. This shouldn't be possible. Civilizations don't work this way. They evolve. Slowly. Over centuries. Over millennia. But Sumer broke the rules. Let me be specific about what appeared all at once. Because when I say sophisticated, I mean genuinely advanced, not primitive by ancient standards. Advanced even by some modern measures. Writing. The Sumerians used cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay. And here's what's remarkable. It appears in the record already developed. Already capable of expressing abstract concepts. Already standardized enough that scribes in different cities could read each other's work. Most writing systems evolve gradually. Pictures become symbols. Symbols become sounds. Simple ideas expressed first, complex thoughts later. It takes centuries. But cuneiform appears with grammar, with verb tenses, with the ability to express past, present, and future. To describe things that aren't physically present. To record not just 10 sheep, but 10 sheep owed by Enlil to the temple, due at harvest. That's not beginning-level writing. That's sophisticated language technology. Mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system, not base 10 like we do. Base 60. And it appears complete. Already optimized for calculation. Already integrated into their astronomy and timekeeping and commerce. We still use their system. 60 seconds in a minute. 60 minutes in an hour. 360 degrees in a circle. 5,000 years later, we haven't found anything better. But where did it come from? How did they decide on 60? Why not 10, which is simpler? Why not 12, which many cultures used? Base 60 is elegant, but it's not obvious. It requires mathematical sophistication to recognize its advantages. The Sumerians had that sophistication from the start. No earlier systems found. No trial with base 10 or base 12 first. Just base 60, fully implemented from the beginning. Astronomy. They tracked Venus, recorded its appearances and disappearances over decades, mapped its pattern with precision that matches modern calculations. They identified the zodiac constellations, divided the sky into 12 sections, understood that planets move differently than stars. This requires sustained observation. You can't figure out Venus in one lifetime. Its pattern is complex. You need multiple generations watching, recording, comparing notes. You need an institutional commitment to astronomy. You need people whose job is to watch the sky every night and write down what they see. The Sumerians had all of this. Immediately, as soon as writing appears, astronomical records appear. Already detailed. Already precise. Already showing understanding that should take centuries to develop. Law. The Code of Ur-Nammu, written around 2100 years before the Common Era, is one of the oldest legal codes we've found, and it's sophisticated. It distinguishes between intentional and accidental harm. It sets proportional punishments. It protects widows and orphans. It regulates commerce and property rights. This isn't primitive justice. This is mature legal philosophy, the kind of nuanced thinking about crime and punishment and social responsibility that usually takes civilizations centuries to develop. But Sumer had it early, already thinking about intent, already understanding that justice requires more than simple revenge, already creating frameworks for a complex society. Engineering. Their irrigation systems turned desert into farmland. Networks of canals, some stretching for miles, bringing water from the Tigris and Euphrates to fields far from the rivers. Reservoirs. Dikes. Gates to control flow. This isn't just digging ditches. This is hydraulic engineering. You need to understand water pressure, gradient, evaporation rates, soil absorption. You need to plan for floods and droughts. You need mathematics to calculate volumes and flow rates. And you need to not make mistakes. Because if your irrigation system fails, your crops die, your people starve, and your city collapses. The Sumerian systems worked. From the beginning, no evidence of massive failures. No abandoned canals that didn't function. No cities that died because the engineering was wrong. They got it right on the first try. Or at least, on the first try we can see in the archaeological record. All of this. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, engineering. All appearing together. All already developed. All already functional. It's like opening a time capsule and finding an iPhone. Without any evidence of earlier phones, without telegraphs or radios or even semaphore signals, just Stone Age tools. Then silence. Then suddenly, a smartphone. Fully functional. That's what the Sumerian archaeological record looks like. And it's been bothering archaeologists for over 170 years. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Sumerians themselves left us a clue. A hint about how they understood their own civilization. In the ruins of temples and palaces, archaeologists have found dedicatory inscriptions. Standard stuff. King so-and-so built this temple to honor such and such god. You find these kinds of inscriptions in every ancient culture. But buried in the middle of some Sumerian inscriptions is a word that stops you cold. A word that doesn't fit the narrative of first civilization, of pioneers inventing everything for the first time. The word is Restoration. Not creation. Not construction. Not establishment. Restoration. The rebuilding of what was before. The recovery of something that existed previously. One tablet from the city of Ur describes the renovation of a temple, and it says, explicitly, this is the restoration of what was before. Not the construction of something new. The restoration of something old. Another text describes a king repairing city walls and claims he is returning them to their ancient form, as they were in the time of the ancestors, before some unspecified catastrophe damaged them. The Sumerians saw themselves as maintainers, preservers, people keeping alive something that was in danger of being lost. They collected old tablets, copied them, made duplicates, stored them in libraries. They were obsessed with preservation in a way that suggests they knew knowledge could disappear, that they were afraid of forgetting. Their king lists begin with the phrase, when kingship descended from heaven. Not when kingship was established by humans. When it descended, when it came from somewhere else, from above, from before. They talked about antediluvian cities, cities before the flood, places that existed in some earlier time, that were destroyed when water covered the world, that were now lost but still remembered. Their mythology is full of references to the ancestors, the old ones, the people who knew things, who understood the world, who possessed wisdom that later generations were struggling to maintain. This is strange language for people who supposedly invented civilization. Inventors don't talk about restoring what was before. Inventors talk about creating what never existed. But people who are rebuilding, people who are recovering from some disaster, people who are trying to remember what their grandparents knew, they talk like this. They talk about restoration, about returning to ancient ways, about preserving the knowledge of the old ones before it's completely forgotten. The Sumerians weren't proud of inventing things. They were anxious about losing things, about forgetting things. That's the psychology of survivors, not pioneers. Now, mainstream archaeology has an explanation for all of this. A reasonable explanation that doesn't require anything mysterious or controversial. They say the earlier phases exist. We just haven't found them yet. Maybe the earliest Sumerian settlements are buried deeper, under water tables that make excavation impossible, under later construction that we haven't removed, in areas that are politically unstable and too dangerous to dig. Maybe the development happened elsewhere, in the mountains to the north or east, in areas that haven't been systematically explored, and by the time the Sumerians reached southern Mesopotamia, they'd already gone through the learning phases, already figured everything out. So what we see isn't the beginning. It's the middle or end of a process that started somewhere else. This is plausible. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, as the saying goes. But there's a problem with this explanation. A gap that doesn't quite close. The gap is time. About 6,000 years of time. Human beings were definitely in Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions after the last ice age ended. We find their camps, their tools, their bones. They were there. But from roughly 12,000 years ago until Sumer appears around 5,500 years ago, there's a 6,000-year period where we find scattered villages, small farming settlements, simple pottery, basic tools, nothing approaching the sophistication of Sumer, nothing that looks like it's heading in that direction, just small-scale human activity, surviving, getting by, but not building anything complex, not organizing into cities, not developing writing or mathematics or astronomy, and then suddenly, Sumer, with all of it, all at once. 6,000 years is a long time. Long enough for development, yes. Long enough for knowledge to accumulate. But where are the intermediate steps? Where are the medium-sized towns between villages and cities? Where are the proto-writing systems between nothing and cuneiform? They should be there, scattered throughout those 6,000 years, getting more sophisticated over time, building toward the complexity we see in Sumer. But we don't find them. Or we find so few that the progression doesn't work. The dots don't connect. Which leaves us with a question that archaeology has been dancing around for over a century. What if the 6,000 years isn't development time? What if it's recovery time? What if something happened? Something catastrophic. Something that destroyed a civilization that already existed. That scattered the survivors. That killed most of the people who knew things. That broke the continuity. And the 6,000 years isn't slow progress toward complexity. It's slow recovery from devastation. Humanity climbing back from a collapse. Rebuilding. Remembering. Trying to restore what was lost. If that's true, then Sumer makes sense. Sumer isn't the invention of civilization. It's the restoration of civilization. The moment when humans finally recovered enough to rebuild what their ancestors had before the catastrophe. Before the world drowned. Chapter 2. The King List Memory. There's a document that makes academics deeply uncomfortable. Not because it's fake or fraudulent, but because if you take it at face value, it doesn't make sense. And if you dismiss it as mythology, you have to explain why the Sumerians themselves treated it as history. It's called the Sumerian King List. And it's one of the strangest historical records ever found. Multiple copies exist. Found in different cities. Nippur, Lhasa, Izin. Written by different scribes at different times. But they all tell the same basic story. They all preserve the same sequence of kings. The same impossibly long reigns. This isn't a religious text. It's not poetry or mythology or philosophical allegory. It's a bureaucratic document, written in the same straightforward style the Sumerians used for everything else. Tax records, grain inventories, commercial contracts. The scribes who wrote the king list were the same people who counted sheep, who recorded temple offerings, who documented legal disputes. They were professional record keepers, not storytellers, not priests inventing myths. When a Sumerian scribe wrote that a shipment contained 43 jars of oil, you could count them and find exactly 43. When they wrote that a field produced 260 bushels of barley, that's what it produced. These people were meticulous, accurate, literal-minded. So when they wrote the king list, they believed they were recording facts, historical facts, facts that might not make sense to us, but facts nonetheless. And the facts they recorded are impossible. The list begins with a statement that echoes through history like a bell that never stops ringing. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Descended, not established, not created, not earned, descended, given, bestowed from above, from somewhere else, from before. And then come the names. 8 kings who ruled before the great flood, before the waters came and swept everything away, before the world was destroyed and had to begin again. Alulim of Eridu. His reign lasted 28,800 years. Alalgar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmen Luana of Bad Tibira, 43,200 years. Enmen Galana of Bad Tibira, 28,800 years. The divine Dumuzid, 36,000 years. Onsipaziana of Larak, 28,800 years. Onmendur-ana of Sipar, 21,000 years. Ubara Tutu of Shurupak, 18,600 years. 8 kings, 8 cities, a total of 241,200 years. Before the flood. These aren't round numbers. They're not symbolic. 28,800 is specific. 43,200 is precise. These are the numbers you use when you're copying from a source, when you're being careful, when you're transcribing what the old records say, even if you don't fully understand them. And here's what's truly unsettling. The scribes didn't question these numbers, didn't add explanatory notes, didn't say this seems unlikely or this is probably symbolic. They just wrote them down, matter-of-factly, the way they wrote everything else, as if 28,000 years was just another number, like 43 jars of oil. But then something happens in the king list. Something dramatic. Something that divides all of history into before and after. The text becomes blunt, direct, almost brutal in its simplicity. Then the flood swept over. That's it. No details. No explanation. No description of what caused it or how long it lasted. Just that simple statement. The flood came. Everything was washed away. And after that line, everything changes. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven again. The cycle begins anew. But this time, the numbers are different. The first post-flood king is Joshua of Kish. His reign lasted 1,200 years. Still impossible by our standards. Still far beyond a human lifespan. But compared to 28,000 years, it's almost reasonable. It's a massive drop. From tens of thousands to merely thousands. And the numbers keep falling. The next king rules for 960 years. Then 840 years. Then 720 years. The reigns are shortening. Quickly. Consistently. Within a few generations, we're down to centuries. Then decades. By the time we reach kings, we can verify through other sources. Kings we know existed as historical figures. The reigns are normal human lengths. 30 years. 25 years. 15 years. It's as if time itself was speeding up. Or lifespans were shrinking. Or whatever made the impossibly long reigns possible was fading from the world. Getting weaker with each generation. The flood serves as the dividing line. The moment when everything changed. When the old world ended and the new world began. When the impossible became merely extraordinary and the extraordinary eventually became ordinary. This pattern appears in other ancient texts too. The Hebrew Bible describes people living for hundreds of years before the flood. Noah lives to be 950 years old. Methuselah lives to be 969. But after the flood, lifespans drop. Abraham lives to 175. Moses to 120. David to 70. The numbers are different than in the Sumerian king list. But the pattern is the same. Long lives before the flood. Shorter lives after. A gradual decline toward normal human lifespans. It's as if both texts are describing the same phenomenon from different perspectives, remembering the same event, the same change in the world. And that event is the flood. The catastrophe. The moment when water covered everything and the old world drowned. The Sumerian king list treats this as a real historical event. Not mythology, not allegory. History. Before the flood, this. After the flood, that. A clear chronological sequence. They're saying that before the flood, the world was different. Time worked differently. Life worked differently. Kings ruled for periods we can't comprehend because the rules themselves were different. And then the flood came. And the old rules stopped working. And humanity had to adapt to new limits. Shorter lives. Smaller scale. A diminished world. But here's the question that keeps nagging. What if they're right? What if there really was a before and after? What if the world really did change? What if something catastrophic happened that didn't just kill people and destroy cities, but altered the conditions of existence itself? What if the flood wasn't just rising water? What if it marked the end of one age and the beginning of another? The death of one world and the birth of the one we live in now? The Sumerians believed this. They wrote it down, preserved it, copied it generation after generation, treated it as the most important historical fact they knew. Maybe we should ask ourselves why. Because here's something that should make us pause. The flood story isn't unique to Sumer. It's everywhere. Literally everywhere. In cultures that had no contact with each other, in places separated by oceans and mountains, in traditions that developed independently, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great Sumerian story, tells it. A man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god Enki that a flood is coming. He builds a boat, takes his family and animals. The waters rise and cover the mountains. Everything drowns. After days of rain, the waters recede. He sends out birds to find dry land. Eventually, the boat comes to rest on a mountain. Humanity begins again. The Hebrew Bible tells the same story. A man named Noah is warned by God that a flood is coming. He builds an ark, takes his family and animals. The waters rise and cover the mountains. Everything drowns. After 40 days and nights, the waters recede. He sends out birds to find dry land. Eventually, the ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat. Humanity begins again. The parallels are exact. Not similar. Exact. Same plot. Same details. Same sequence of events. Even some of the same phrasing when you read the original languages. But it's not just the Middle East. The Hindu Vedas describe Manu, warned by a fish god that a flood will destroy the world. He builds a boat, survives, becomes the ancestor of all humans after the waters recede. Chinese mythology tells of Gunyu taming the great flood that covered the world. Japanese legends speak of waters that drowned the old world. Greek myths describe Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving when Zeus floods the earth to punish humanity. The Maya Popol Vuh describes a great flood that destroyed the previous creation. The Aztec legends tell of the world being destroyed by water before the current age. Inca traditions speak of the Great Flood from which only a few survived. Australian Aboriginal stories, some of the oldest continuous oral traditions on Earth, describe the time when the seas rose and swallowed the coastal lands, when islands became mountains, when the ancestors had to flee inland. Native American tribes across both continents have flood stories. The Hopi, the Lakota, the Ojibwe, the Salish, the Cherokee, separated by thousands of miles. Different languages, different cultures, but the same basic story: the world covered in water. Few survivors. A new beginning. How? How do cultures with no contact, no shared language, no trade routes, all remember the same catastrophe? How do people separated by entire oceans tell the same story? The standard explanation is that floods are common. Every culture experiences them. So, every culture develops flood mythology. It's coincidence, parallel development, the human tendency to explain natural disasters through stories, but that doesn't explain the specifics. Why do so many describe a worldwide flood, not just a local one? Why do so many include the detail about birds being sent to find land? Why do so many describe mountains being covered? Local floods don't cover mountains. Local floods don't require boats to survive. Local floods don't destroy the entire world and require humanity to start over. These stories describe something bigger, something global, something that affected everyone, everywhere, at the same time. And modern geology gives us a candidate, a real event, a documented catastrophe that matches what the myths describe. At the end of the last ice age, around 11,600 years ago, something happened. The ice sheets that covered much of North America and Europe began to melt. Not gradually, rapidly, catastrophically. Sea levels rose. Not by inches, by hundreds of feet. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years disappeared underwater. River valleys flooded. Islands vanished. Entire ecosystems drowned. If you were living on the coast when this happened, and humans definitely were, your world ended. The places your ancestors had lived for generations were gone. Underwater. Unreachable. You fled inland, carrying what you could, remembering what you'd lost. And you told your children, and they told their children, and the story got passed down. Generation after generation. For thousands of years. Different cultures, different languages, different details added and subtracted. But the core memory remained. The world was different once. Lower, drier. Then the waters came, and everything changed. Maybe the flood myths aren't mythology at all. Maybe they're history, distorted by time, transformed by retelling, but at their core, accurate, a preserved memory of something that really happened, something that destroyed the world as it was, and forced the survivors to build a new one. And maybe, just maybe, the Sumerian king list is trying to tell us what was lost when the waters rose. What existed before, in that other world, the one that drowned. Chapter 3. The Younger DRYAS Catastrophe. Let's talk about what science tells us happened 12,800 years ago. Because this is where mythology and geology converge, where ancient stories and modern evidence point to the same event. It's called the Younger DRYAS, a period of rapid, catastrophic climate change that marks the end of the last ice age. And it began suddenly, violently, in a way that still puzzles scientists. For context, the Earth had been warming for thousands of years. The great ice sheets were slowly retreating, temperatures rising, a gradual transition from ice age to the warmer climate we know today. And then, around 12,800 years ago, everything reversed. Temperatures plunged. In some places, they dropped by 15 degrees Fahrenheit, in less than a decade. The warming stopped. The ice began advancing again. It was as if someone had thrown a switch and sent the planet back into deep freeze. This cold period lasted for about 1200 years. Then, just as suddenly, it ended. Temperatures shot up. The ice melted. Fast. Faster than it had during the gradual warming that came before. Scientists have debated for decades what caused this. What could trigger such a sudden climate reversal? And then, such a rapid warming. One theory has gained significant support in recent years: the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The evidence suggests that around 12,800 years ago, fragments of a comet struck Earth. Not one large impact, multiple smaller ones, hitting ice sheets in North America and Europe, possibly hitting oceans as well. The evidence is there in the geological record. A layer of sediment dating to exactly this time contains unusual materials, microscopic diamonds that only form under extreme pressure, platinum in concentrations that suggest extraterrestrial origin, carbon spherules indicating massive fires, a thin layer that covers much of the northern hemisphere, the signature of impact, of something from space hitting Earth with tremendous force. Ice cores from Greenland show it. Sediment samples from across North America show it. Even the ocean floor shows it. A distinct layer marking a moment of catastrophe. When comet fragments hit the ice sheets, they didn't create craters like impacts on bare rock. The ice absorbed the energy, melted, exploded into steam and water. Massive amounts of fresh water dumped into the oceans in a very short time. This influx of cold, fresh water disrupted ocean currents. The Gulf Stream, which carries warm water from the tropics to northern Europe, shut down or weakened dramatically. Without that warmth, temperatures crashed. Snow fell, accumulated. The ice began advancing again, but the melting didn't stop entirely. It continued, more slowly at first, then accelerating. The ice sheets were unstable now, fractured, weakened. Over the next 1,000 years, they continued to collapse. And when the Younger Dryas ended, when temperatures suddenly spiked upward again around 11,600 years ago, the melting became catastrophic. Entire sections of ice sheets, miles thick, collapsed into the ocean. Massive floods poured down river valleys. Lake-sized bodies of meltwater trapped behind ice dams burst free and rushed to the sea. Sea levels rose. Not gradually. In pulses. In surges. In some periods, perhaps rising by feet per year, by tens of feet per decade. If you were living on the coast, this was the end of the world. Your village flooded. Your fields drowned. Your ancestors' graves disappeared underwater. Everything you knew, everything your people had built over generations, was erased. You had two choices: die, or flee inland, to higher ground, away from the rising waters. Most people probably died. The archaeological record shows a massive population decline during this period. Human numbers crashed. Settlements vanished. The comfortable niches where people had lived for thousands of years became uninhabitable. But some survived. Some fled. Some carried with them the memory of what was lost and the determination to never forget. Now let's talk about what drowned, because this is crucial. This is where we understand what might have been lost. At the peak of the last ice age, sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than they are today. 400 feet. That's a staggering amount. Coastlines were completely different. Land that's now ocean floor was dry ground. Fertile ground in many cases. River valleys. Plains. Places where humans could and did live. The Persian Gulf, for example. Today it's a body of water roughly the size of the Black Sea. But during the Ice Age, it was dry land. A river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers joined together and flowed south through what's now underwater, creating a lush, fertile corridor. This would have been prime real estate for early humans. Protected on three sides by high ground. Abundant fresh water. Rich soil from river flooding. Access to both inland and coastal resources. If there was an advanced culture in the Middle East before Sumer, this is where it would have been. In the Persian Gulf Basin, where the conditions were perfect, where humans could thrive, and now it's under 300 feet of water, completely inaccessible with current technology. buried under 12,000 years of sediment. If there were cities there, if there were farms and temples and harbors, they're gone, hidden beneath the waves. We can't excavate underwater sites at that depth. Not easily. Not comprehensively. We've barely scratched the surface of shallow water archaeology. The deep continental shelves remain unexplored. But sonar surveys have found anomalies. Geometric shapes on the seafloor. Straight lines where nature doesn't create straight lines. Patterns that suggest human construction. We don't know what they are. Can't investigate further without massive investment and technological advancement. But they're there. Waiting. The same is true for coastlines worldwide. The Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the South China Sea. Everywhere the seas rose, they covered land where humans lived. The Black Sea has underwater ruins. Structures at depths that suggest they were built when sea levels were lower. When the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, before the Mediterranean broke through and flooded it catastrophically. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka, underwater structures have been found. Walls, foundations, artifacts, dating to 9,000 years ago or older. Evidence of human habitation well before the Indus Valley civilization is supposed to have begun. Near Japan, off Yonaguni Island, there are underwater formations that look remarkably like stepped pyramids, carved angles, flat surfaces, stairs. Natural erosion doesn't create such features, but without further investigation, we can't be certain. The point is this: millions of square miles of land are now underwater. Land that humans occupied during the Ice Age. Land that flooded when the ice melted. Land we haven't explored. Land we can't explore without significant effort and resources. If there were civilizations on those coastlines, if there were cities and farms and centers of learning, they're lost. As completely lost as if they'd been on another planet. The rising seas didn't just kill people. They erased history, buried evidence, created a gap in the archaeological record that might be permanent. And the survivors, the ones who fled inland, they had nothing but memory, no ability to go back, no way to recover what was lost. Just stories, warnings, desperate attempts to preserve fragments of knowledge before they too were forgotten. Maybe that's what we see in Sumer, not the invention of civilization, but the resurrection of it, by people whose grandparents' remembered when the world was different, when the coastlines were elsewhere, when the cities stood on land that now lies beneath the waves. Let's think about what it takes to destroy evidence of a civilization, to erase it so completely that future archaeologists would question whether it ever existed. Fire doesn't do it. Fire destroys organic materials but leaves ruins. Stone foundations, pottery shards, metal objects. You can tell a city burned. You can excavate the destruction layer. War doesn't do it. Conquest might destroy a culture's political structure, but the physical remains stay. The buildings, the artifacts, the written records. Conquerors often preserve what they conquer, adapting it for their own use. Even time doesn't do it easily. We find Stone Age camps from 50,000 years ago. Simple rings of stones where people made fires. Basic tools. Bone fragments. Time degrades things but rarely erases them completely. But water is different. Water is the perfect eraser. When land floods, when it goes underwater permanently, everything changes. Structures collapse under their own weight without air for support. Organic materials dissolve. Pottery disintegrates. Metal corrodes. Wood rots away completely. And then the sediment begins. Rivers carry silt. Ocean currents deposit sand. Biological material accumulates. Dead organisms. Shell fragments. Layers building up year after year. Century after century. Over 12,000 years, in an active marine environment, you could accumulate 50 to 100 feet of sediment. More in river deltas. More in areas with strong currents. Whatever was there originally gets buried. Not just covered. Buried deep. Under layers of mud and sand and biological debris. Under the weight of 12 millennia. To find it, you'd need to know where to look. You'd need to strip away the sediment. You'd need specialized equipment. Underwater robots. Sonar mapping. Core samples. And then you'd need to excavate underwater. which is exponentially more difficult than excavating on land. And even if you did all that, even if you found something, you'd have trouble dating it, trouble identifying it, trouble proving what it was. This is the perfect erasure. Not violent, not dramatic, just thorough, comprehensive. The kind of erasure that makes people doubt anything was ever there. If there was a civilization on the coastlines that drowned, if there were cities in the Persian Gulf Basin, if there were harbors on the Mediterranean shores that are now 300 feet underwater, we might never find them. We might spend centuries looking and find nothing conclusive. And that absence of evidence would be interpreted as evidence of absence. We'd say there's no evidence of advanced civilization before Sumer, therefore there wasn't one. But that logic only works if we've looked everywhere. If we've exhausted all possibilities. And we haven't. We've barely started. The ocean floors remain largely unexplored. The continental shelves where humans would have lived, the river deltas that would have been prime settlement locations. They're unmapped, unstudied, full of anomalies that might be natural formations or might be something else entirely. We don't know, because we haven't looked. Can't look with current resources. Won't look unless someone makes it a priority. So the evidence, if it exists, remains buried. Under hundreds of feet of water and sediment, waiting, perfectly preserved in some cases, completely dissolved in others. But either way, inaccessible. And the only record of what was lost are the stories, the myths, the flood legends that every culture preserved, the insistence in Sumerian texts that they were restoring, not creating. That kingship descended from heaven, from before, from the time that came earlier. Maybe we should take those stories more seriously. Not as literal truth necessarily, but as distorted memories, echoes of something real. Something that happened, something that was important enough to remember for 12,000 years. Because that's a long time to keep telling a story. Unless the story matters. Unless it's trying to preserve something essential, a warning perhaps, or a memory, or both. Imagine you're living on the coast. Your family has been there for generations. You know every inlet, every fishing spot, every place where fresh water meets the sea, and then the water starts rising. Not all at once, but persistently, year after year. The beach you played on as a child is underwater now. The caves where your grandparents sheltered are filling with waves. The low-lying fields where you grew crops are turning into marshland. You move inland, build higher. But the water keeps coming. Relentless. Unstoppable. Some years it rises barely noticeably. Other years it surges, driven by storms, by tides, by the continued melting of distant ice. Your village decides to abandon the coast entirely. To flee to higher ground. You pack what you can carry. Leave behind everything heavy. Everything that can't make the journey. Your grandmother's grinding stones. The ceremonial pottery. The stone markers on your ancestors' graves. You walk inland. To the highlands. To the hills. Away from the water that's swallowing your world. Other refugees are doing the same. Coming from different directions. Different communities. Some you know. Some are strangers. All fleeing the rising seas. You settle where you can. In places that are already occupied, causing tension. Or in marginal lands that nobody wanted before. You struggle. Food is scarce. The populations are too large for the available resources. Conflict is common. But you survive. Barely. Your children survive. And you tell them about the old world. The one that drowned. The cities on the coast. The knowledge that was lost. The way things used to be. And they tell their children. And the story gets passed down. Simplified over time. Mythologized. But never forgotten. Because it's too important. Because it explains where you came from. Why things are the way they are. Why the old people know things that seem impossible. This is how knowledge survives catastrophe. Not in libraries. Those burn. Not in monuments. Those erode. But in stories. In memory. In the determination of survivors to make sure the next generation knows what happened. And maybe that's what we're seeing in Sumer. The end point of that process. 6,000 years after the catastrophe. After generations of refugees. After the slow, painful process of rebuilding. After oral traditions hardened into ritual. After stories became sacred, after the survivors' descendants finally recovered enough to write things down, to create cities again, to restore the knowledge, to rebuild civilization, not as something new, but as something remembered, as something that existed before and was trying to exist again. The Sumerians weren't the first. They were the rememberers, the ones who refused to forget, who carried the spark through the darkness, who lit the fire again when the long night finally ended. Chapter 4. The Knowledge They Preserved. Let's go back to what the Sumerians knew, because this is where the theory of inherited knowledge becomes compelling, where the evidence stops fitting the standard explanation. Take their astronomy, specifically, their tracking of Venus. Venus is not an easy planet to observe systematically. Its pattern is complex, irregular to the untrained eye. Sometimes it appears as the morning star, sometimes as the evening star, sometimes it's visible for months. Sometimes it disappears behind the sun for weeks at a time. To understand Venus, to predict its movements, you need continuous observation over decades. Multiple decades. You need to watch it through multiple cycles, record every appearance and disappearance. Note the intervals. Compare patterns across years. This requires infrastructure, an institution dedicated to watching the sky, astronomers whose job is observation and record keeping, a writing system to document what they see, a mathematical system to analyze the patterns, and most importantly, continuity. Generation after generation maintaining the project, the Sumerians had records of Venus going back centuries, tablets showing its positions, its rising and setting times, the intervals of visibility and invisibility, and when modern astronomers input this ancient data into computer models, something remarkable happens. The Sumerian observations are accurate, not approximately accurate, not close enough for ancient times. Actually accurate. They match what Venus really did during those periods, down to the day in many cases. How? How did they achieve this precision? The standard answer is that they watched carefully, that they had good astronomers, that they valued celestial observation for religious or agricultural reasons, that they accumulated knowledge over the centuries we can document. But here's the problem. The accuracy appears too early. The sophistication shows up in the oldest records we have, not as the culmination of centuries of improvement, but right at the beginning. It's as if they started with the answer, as if someone taught them where to look and what to record, as if the methodology was inherited, not discovered. And then there's the precession question. This is more controversial, more speculative, but worth considering. Precession is the slow wobble of Earth's axis. Like a spinning top that's starting to tip, Earth's rotational axis traces a circle in space, a very slow circle, taking 26,000 years to complete one cycle. This wobble changes which stars appear to be the North Star, changes the position of constellations relative to the seasons. The shift is tiny in a human lifetime, about 1 degree every 72 years. You'd barely notice it, but over centuries, it becomes measurable. Over millennia, it's obvious. The spring equinox, which occurred in the constellation Taurus 6,000 years ago, occurs in Pisces now. The background stars have shifted. Some researchers believe Sumerian texts encode knowledge of precession, references to great ages, to cycles of time measured in thousands of years, to the stars moving through their houses. If true, this would require astronomical observation going back not centuries, but millennia. Continuous observation, careful record keeping, institutional memory spanning time periods longer than most civilizations exist. The Sumerians didn't have that much time. Not that we can document. Their cities existed for maybe 2,000 years before other cultures absorbed them. But what if they inherited the observations? What if the people before the flood, the ones with impossibly long reigns in the king list, the ones who watched the sky from cities now underwater, they were the ones who tracked precession? What if they observed the stars for thousands of years, passed down their records? And when the catastrophe came, when the cities drowned, the survivors brought those records inland, preserved them, copied them, eventually wrote them into Sumerian tablets. That would explain the sophistication, the early accuracy, the sense that Sumerian astronomy didn't evolve. It appeared complete, already advanced, because it wasn't developed in Sumer, it was remembered. The mathematics tells a similar story. The base 60 system that appears fully formed in the earliest Sumerian records. Base 60 is not intuitive. It's not the obvious choice for a culture just figuring out numbers. Most ancient cultures used base 10. Counting on fingers. Simple. Natural. Easy. Some used base 20. Fingers and toes. Still makes sense. Still based on human anatomy. Still discoverable through everyday experience. But base 60. There's no anatomical reason for it. No obvious natural model. It's abstract. Sophisticated. Chosen for mathematical elegance, not biological convenience. 60 has more divisors than any smaller number. You can divide it evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes calculations easier, makes fractions simpler, makes astronomy and geometry more precise. But you'd only choose base 60 if you already understood these advantages, if you'd compared different systems, if you'd done enough mathematics to recognize which base works best for complex calculations. That takes time. That takes experimentation. That takes mathematical sophistication. Yet base 60 appears in Sumer immediately. In the oldest texts, already implemented, already integrated into their timekeeping, their geometry, their astronomy. No evidence of earlier systems. No trial with base 10 first. No experimental phase. It's there, from the beginning, as if it was always there, as if they brought it with them, and it never changed. For thousands of years, through multiple civilizations, through conquest and cultural transformation, base 60 persisted. Babylon used it. Assyria used it. Persia used it. Greece adopted it. Rome inherited it. We still use it. 5,000 years later. 60 seconds. 60 minutes. 360 degrees. Because nobody's found a better system. Because the Sumerians, or whoever taught them, chose correctly the first time. This is the signature of inherited knowledge. Of a system that wasn't developed through trial and error. Of mathematics that came from somewhere else. From before. From people who'd already solved these problems and passed down the solutions. The Sumerians were using a mathematical system more sophisticated than they needed, than their immediate applications required. Why? Unless they inherited it. Unless they were maintaining a tradition they didn't fully understand but knew was important. Unless they were preserving knowledge from a more advanced time. The engineering is perhaps the most telling evidence. Because engineering is practical. It either works or it doesn't. There's no faking it. No symbolic interpretation. If your irrigation system fails, your crops die. The Sumerian irrigation systems worked. From the earliest periods we can document. No massive failures in the archaeological record. No abandoned canals that didn't function. No cities that collapsed because the water management was wrong. They got it right. Seemingly on the first try. But irrigation engineering is complex. You need to understand hydrology, how water flows, how gravity works, how to calculate gradients so water moves where you want it without eroding the channels. You need to understand soil, which types hold water, which types absorb it, how to prevent salinization, how to manage drainage. You need to understand weather patterns, seasonal variations, flood cycles, drought preparation. All of this takes experimentation, failure, learning. You try one method, it doesn't work. You try another. Eventually, through accumulated experience, you figure out what works. Where are the Sumerian failures? Where are the learning attempts? They should be there. In the earliest layers, simple ditches that eroded, reservoirs that collapsed, fields that flooded because the gradient was wrong. The mistakes that every culture makes when learning something new, we don't find them. Or we find so few that the progression doesn't work. It's as if they started with sophisticated systems, as if someone taught them, as if they were following instructions from people who'd already solved these problems. The same is true for their architecture. The ziggurats aligned to cardinal directions with remarkable precision. How did they determine true north without compasses? How did they maintain that precision across such massive structures? The standard answer is careful observation, using the stars, which is true, but it takes practice. It takes multiple attempts. It takes refinement. Yet the earliest ziggurats are already aligned, already precise, already showing mastery that should come later. After generations of building, after learning from mistakes, unless they weren't learning, unless they were remembering, unless they had inherited instructions, maybe not written instructions, maybe oral knowledge, maybe the survivors from the coast, the ones who fled inland, they brought with them not just stories, but practical knowledge, engineering knowledge, astronomical knowledge, mathematical knowledge, and they taught it, passed it down, maintained it, until finally, when conditions allowed, when the population recovered, when the resources were available, they used that knowledge to rebuild, to create cities, to restore civilization, not inventing it, restoring it. Just like their inscriptions said, here's what troubles me about the conventional explanation. The timeline doesn't work. If the Sumerians developed all of this themselves, if they invented writing and mathematics and astronomy and engineering through their own efforts, then where are the centuries of development? Where are the proto-writing systems? The pictographs that slowly became abstract symbols? The gradual evolution from simple pictures to complex script? Where are the early mathematical texts? The basic counting? The simple addition? The gradual discovery of more complex operations? Where are the failed observatories? The misaligned temples? The irrigation systems that didn't work? The learning curve that every technology goes through? They're not there. Or they're so rare, so scattered, that they don't form a progression, don't show evolution, don't demonstrate the slow accumulation of knowledge that we expect. Instead, we find sophistication appearing suddenly, systems that work immediately, knowledge that seems complete from the start. This pattern is consistent across everything we've discussed: writing, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, law, medicine, all of it appearing together, all of it already developed. The conventional explanation asks us to believe that all of these developments happened during the 6,000-year gap, the period after the Ice Age ended but before Sumer emerged. That somewhere, somehow, during those millennia, humans figured all of this out, and then brought it to Sumer. But where? We've explored the surrounding regions, Anatolia, the Levant, Iran. We find simple villages, basic agriculture, nothing approaching Sumerian sophistication. So where did it come from? Where did they learn it? Who taught them? The alternative explanation is simpler. They inherited it from before, from the culture that existed on the coastlines, now underwater, from the civilization that drowned when the ice melted and the seas rose. That culture had time, had centuries, maybe millennia, to develop these systems, to perfect them, to create the sophisticated knowledge that appears suddenly in Sumer. And when catastrophe came, some survived, fled inland, brought the knowledge with them, preserved it through oral tradition, maintained it through ritual and teaching, until finally, 6,000 years later, conditions allowed them to write it down, to rebuild, to restore. If that's what happened, then everything makes sense. The sudden appearance, the lack of development stages, the sophisticated systems, the Sumerian insistence that they were restoring, not inventing, it all fits. If you're willing to accept that there was something before, something that was lost, something that the Sumerians spent their entire civilization trying to remember. Chapter 5. The gods were the ancestors. Now we need to address the gods, the Anunnaki, the beings the Sumerians said came from heaven and taught them everything. For decades, this has been the territory of ancient astronaut theorists. The claim that extraterrestrials visited Earth, that aliens genetically engineered humans, that flying saucers brought civilization from the stars. I'm not going there, not because it's impossible, but because there's a simpler explanation, one that fits the evidence better, one that doesn't require interstellar travel. What if the gods weren't from another planet? What if they were from another time? What if they were human? Just more advanced humans, survivors from the pre-flood civilization who seemed like gods to the Stone Age people they encountered after the catastrophe. Think about it. You're a hunter-gatherer, living simply. Stone tools, animal skins for clothing, oral tradition, no writing, no mathematics, basic survival. And then you meet someone different, someone who can read and write, who understands astronomy, who can predict eclipses, who knows how to irrigate fields, who can work metal, who builds permanent structures, who has knowledge you can't even comprehend. To you, that person might as well be a god. They have powers you don't understand. They know things you don't know. They can do things that seem impossible. You wouldn't think, oh, they're from a more advanced culture. You'd think they're divine, supernatural, sent from the heavens. This is exactly how later Europeans were perceived when they arrived in cultures that hadn't experienced their technology. Cargo cults formed in the Pacific Islands. Indigenous peoples interpreted European technology through the only framework they had: magic, divine power, beings from another realm. The Anunnaki might have been the same thing, not aliens, but survivors from the drowned coastal civilization, people who retained knowledge, who kept skills alive, who wandered among the scattered post-catastrophe populations, teaching, organizing, trying to rebuild. And they were remembered as gods, because to the people they taught, people living in the aftermath of catastrophe, people who'd lost most of their own knowledge and capability, these survivors seemed divine. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as physical beings. They eat, they drink, they get tired, they make mistakes. They argue with each other. They form factions. They have political disagreements. These aren't descriptions of supernatural entities. These are descriptions of people. Powerful people. Knowledgeable people. But people nonetheless. The texts say the Anunnaki taught humanity. Agriculture. Writing. Mathematics. Law. Medicine. All the foundations of civilization. Not through magic, but through instruction, through demonstration, through patient teaching over generations. This is exactly what you'd expect from survivors trying to rebuild, trying to pass on what they knew, trying to restore civilization by teaching the scattered, traumatized remnants of humanity how to organize, how to build, how to create stable societies again. And when these teachers died, when the last generation that personally remembered the pre-flood world finally passed away, they became legendary, mythical, their human origins forgotten, their knowledge attributed to divine wisdom, their accomplishments explained as supernatural intervention, but the core memory remained. That civilization came from before. That knowledge was given, not discovered. That the gods, whoever they were, descended from heaven, meaning from the place that came before, and taught humanity how to live. Every ancient culture has them. Figures who appear and teach civilization, who give knowledge, who transform primitive people into organized societies. In Sumer, Enki is the primary culture bringer, the god of wisdom, of fresh water, of crafts and knowledge. The texts say he taught humans how to build cities, how to write, how to practice agriculture, how to create law. But Enki is described doing very human things. He gets drunk, he makes deals, he outsmarts other gods through cleverness, not supernatural power. He sides with humanity against the other gods. He warns Yusudra about the coming flood and tells him how to survive. This doesn't sound like a supernatural deity. It sounds like a leader, a knowledgeable individual, someone with access to information, someone who chose to share that information with people who didn't have it. In Egypt, they remember Thoth, the god who taught writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, the record keeper, the measurer of time. Again, described doing practical things, teaching practical knowledge. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who taught agriculture, who brought the calendar, who established law. The stories say he came from across the water, from the east, from a land that was destroyed, and he taught the survivors how to rebuild. In South America, Viracocha, the foam of the sea, who appeared after a great flood, who taught the people how to cultivate crops. how to build, how to organize society, then disappeared, promising to return. In Mesopotamia, Oannes, a being who emerged from the Persian Gulf, half human, half fish in the descriptions, who taught the people during the day and returned to the sea at night, who gave them writing, astronomy, law, then left. The pattern repeats. Across cultures, across continents, beings who appear after catastrophe, who teach civilization, who are remembered as gods but described doing human things, teaching human knowledge. What if these aren't myths? What if they're distorted memories of real people, survivors from the advanced pre-flood culture, who retained knowledge, who traveled among the scattered post-catastrophe populations, who taught what they knew? They would have seemed magical, their knowledge so far beyond what the survivors possessed that it would appear supernatural. Their ability to read the stars, to predict seasons, to heal diseases, to organize labor, all of it would seem like divine power. But it was just knowledge, advanced knowledge, preserved knowledge, knowledge from before the catastrophe. And these culture bringers didn't live forever. They were human. They aged. They died. But before they died, they taught. They trained successors. They established priesthoods, institutions dedicated to preserving the knowledge, to maintaining the traditions, to keeping alive what the pre-flood world had known. Those institutions became the temples, the scribal schools, the astronomical observatories, the centers of learning that characterized early civilizations, not invented by those civilizations, but inherited, continued, maintained. The priests weren't just religious figures, they were the keepers of knowledge, the preservers of tradition, the guardians of secrets that went back to before the flood, to the time when the gods walked among men, when the culture bringers taught humanity how to be civilized again. The most compelling evidence isn't any single culture's story. It's the pattern, the repetition across cultures that had no contact. When one culture has a flood myth, you can explain it as local experience. When two have similar myths, you can call it coincidence. But when dozens of cultures, separated by oceans, speaking different languages, having no trade or communication, all tell versions of the same story, something else is happening. They're not borrowing from each other. They're remembering the same event, independently, from different perspectives, but the core is the same. There was a world before. It was destroyed by water. A few survived. They preserved knowledge. They taught the next generation. Civilization was rebuilt. The details vary. The names change. The specific gods are different. The locations shift. But the structure remains constant. This is what you'd expect from genuine historical memory. The core facts preserved across cultures. The details adapted to local contexts. The essential truth maintained even as the specifics transform. If these were just myths, just stories cultures invented to explain floods or natural disasters, they wouldn't match this closely. They'd be more random, more varied. Each culture would create whatever story fit their particular circumstances. But they don't. They tell the same story, over and over, in different words but with the same meaning. A great catastrophe, usually water. The old world destroyed. Most people died. A few survived. They had knowledge. They taught. Civilization was restored. The survivors were remembered as gods or heroes or culture bringers. And they came from the time before, from the place that was lost. This pattern is too consistent to be coincidence, too widespread to be cultural diffusion, too specific to be generic myth-making. It's memory, preserved across 12,000 years, passed down through 300 generations, transformed by time, but never completely lost. The Sumerians were part of this pattern. Their gods came from heaven, meaning from before, from the previous age, from the civilization that drowned. Those gods were their ancestors, the survivors, the ones who carried knowledge through the catastrophe, who spent generations trying to teach what they remembered, who established the foundations that eventually became Sumerian civilization. The Anunnaki weren't aliens. They were us, an earlier version of us, more advanced in some ways because they'd had more time, because they'd built a civilization that lasted long enough to develop sophisticated knowledge. And when that civilization died, when the waters rose and the cities drowned, some of them survived, fled inland, brought their knowledge, and slowly, painfully, over thousands of years, taught the survivors how to rebuild. That's the story the Sumerians preserved, not in the clear, explicit way I'm stating it, but encoded in their myths, in their king lists, in their insistence that civilization was restored, not invented, that it descended from heaven, from before, from the ancestors who knew. We've dismissed this as mythology because it doesn't fit our timeline. Our assumption that civilization began with Sumer, that nothing advanced came before. But what if we're wrong? What if the Sumerians knew their own history better than we do? What if their stories, underneath the mythological language, underneath the divine names and supernatural elements, contain truth? What if there really was something before? And they remembered. Chapter 6. The 6,000-year gap. Let's talk about time. About the gap between the catastrophe and Sumer. About what happened during those 6,000 years. The Younger Dryas ended around 11,600 years ago. The rapid warming, the catastrophic melting, the rising seas, that's when the world as humans knew it was destroyed. Sumer emerged around 5,500 years ago. Writing, cities, complex civilization. That's when we see recovery complete enough to leave permanent records. 6,000 years between catastrophe and restoration. What happened during that time? The conventional view is that this was development time. Humans slowly figuring things out. Agriculture gradually improving. Villages slowly growing. Knowledge accumulating. Until finally, everything came together in Sumer. But that's not what the evidence shows. The evidence shows something different. Something that looks more like trauma recovery than steady development. Population crashed after the Younger Dryas. Dramatically, archaeological sites become sparse. Settlements decrease in number and size. The comfortable patterns of late Ice Age life were shattered. People were scattered, displaced, living in marginal environments, struggling. The good coastal lands where humans had thrived were underwater. The river valleys were disrupted. The climate was unstable. This wasn't an environment for cultural advancement. This was survival mode. Populations too small to support specialization. Resources too scarce to invest in long-term projects. Knowledge too fragmented to maintain complex systems. For thousands of years, humans were in crisis. Not advancing. Barely maintaining. Losing more than they gained. We see this in the archaeological record. The tools become simpler. The art less sophisticated. The settlements smaller. It's regression, not progression. Humanity was going backward. But knowledge wasn't entirely lost. Because some people remembered. The survivors from the coastal civilizations, the ones who carried memories, who maintained oral traditions, who told their children about the old world, about how things used to be, about the knowledge that existed before the flood. These memories were kept alive in priesthoods, in ritual, in sacred stories passed from generation to generation, not understood completely anymore. Fragments, pieces, but preserved, protected, maintained even when they didn't fully make sense. This is how knowledge survives dark ages. Not in libraries. Those are too vulnerable. Not in monuments. Those erode. But in people, in traditions, in stories told around fires, in rituals performed year after year, even when the original meaning is forgotten. For 6,000 years, scattered groups of survivors maintained these traditions, kept the knowledge alive, waited for conditions to improve, for populations to recover, for resources to become available again. And slowly, gradually, conditions did improve. The climate stabilized. Agriculture spread. Populations grew. Villages became towns. Trade networks re-established. By 5,500 years ago, in Mesopotamia, things had recovered enough. The population was large enough. The resources sufficient. The political organization stable enough. And the preserved knowledge still intact enough. That's when they could finally do it. Finally rebuild. Finally restore what had been lost. Finally write down the knowledge that had been maintained orally for millennia. That's when Sumer happened. Not as a beginning, As a culmination, the end of recovery, the restoration complete. We underestimate oral tradition. In our writing-saturated world, we assume that knowledge needs to be written to survive. That oral transmission is unreliable. That stories change too much. But oral cultures develop sophisticated methods for preserving information. Methods that work, that maintain accuracy over incredible time spans. Australian Aboriginal traditions preserve accurate geographical information about coastlines that existed over 10,000 years ago. They describe islands that are now underwater, passages between lands that are now separated by sea. And when archaeologists check, the descriptions are correct. The stories preserved real geography from before the seas rose. Native American traditions describe volcanic eruptions that happened 7,000 years ago, with enough detail that geologists can identify which eruptions they're describing. The stories survived, accurate, for hundreds of generations. In Polynesia, navigation knowledge was preserved orally for thousands of years. Complex mathematical and astronomical information, enabling voyages across thousands of miles of open ocean, all without writing. All maintained through memorization, through chanting, through ritual teaching. Oral tradition works when the culture values it, when institutions exist to maintain it, when people are trained specifically to remember, to recite accurately, to pass on knowledge without alteration. This is what priesthoods did in the ancient world. They weren't just religious leaders. They were knowledge keepers, memory holders, the institutions that bridged the gap between catastrophe and recovery. In Mesopotamia, before writing, there would have been priestly lineages, families whose role was preservation, who memorized astronomical observations, mathematical principles, engineering knowledge, agricultural techniques, medical practices, legal precedents. They would have trained their children, drilled the information, used rhythm and repetition and ritual to make it memorable, created mnemonic devices, encoded knowledge in stories and ceremonies. This knowledge would seem like magic to outsiders, like supernatural wisdom, because it came from the ancestors, from the gods, from the time before, and it was guarded, protected, only taught to initiates who proved worthy. But it was just knowledge, preserved knowledge, maintained through oral tradition across the millennia when writing didn't exist, when populations were too small and scattered to support written record keeping, and when conditions finally allowed, when Sumer emerged and writing was invented or reinvented, these oral traditions were the source. The priests who'd memorized the astronomy, the engineers who'd maintained the irrigation techniques, the mathematicians who'd preserved the base 60 system, they finally had a way to make the knowledge permanent, to write it down, to create external memory that didn't depend on human lifespans, to ensure that even if the knowledge keepers died, the knowledge itself would survive. That's why Sumerian writing appears sophisticated immediately, why the mathematics is already advanced, why the astronomy is already precise. It wasn't invented in that moment. It was transcribed, written down for the first time, but based on knowledge that had existed for thousands of years in oral form. The Sumerians weren't creating, they were documenting, recording, making permanent what had previously existed only in memory. But why Sumer specifically? Why did restoration happen there? Why not somewhere else? Geography. As always, geography matters. Mesopotamia was ideal for what needed to happen. The Tigris and Euphrates provided reliable water. The soil was fertile when irrigated. The region was protected enough to allow stability, but connected enough to facilitate trade. It was a Goldilocks location. Not too isolated, not too exposed. Just right for civilization to emerge. But more importantly, Mesopotamia was where the survivors had gone, where the refugees from the drowned Persian Gulf basin had settled, where the knowledge keepers had established themselves. Remember, the Persian Gulf was dry land during the Ice Age, a river valley, potentially the center of the pre-flood civilization. When the seas rose, when that valley flooded, the survivors didn't go far. They moved inland, up the rivers, into the highlands that became southern Mesopotamia. This wasn't random. This was continuity. The same region, the same river systems, the same geographic context, just elevated. On higher ground, that the rising waters couldn't reach. The survivors settled where conditions were closest to what they'd known, where they could apply their knowledge, where the rivers still flowed, where irrigation was possible, where they could rebuild something resembling what they'd lost. And they maintained their traditions, their knowledge, their determination to restore, for 6,000 years, through countless generations, through periods of hardship and setback. They maintained. Other regions might have had survivors too. Other refugee populations maintaining fragments of knowledge, but Mesopotamia had the combination, the right geography, the right continuity, the right concentration of preserved knowledge. When the recovery finally happened, when conditions allowed civilization to re-emerge, Mesopotamia was ready. The knowledge was there. The geography was suitable. The population had recovered enough. The resources were available. And the priests, the knowledge keepers, the inheritors of pre-flood wisdom, they still knew what to do. They still had the astronomy, the mathematics, the engineering principles, the organizational structures. They weren't inventing civilization. They were implementing it, following a template that had existed before, restoring what their ancestors had built, making real again what had existed only in memory for 6,000 years. That's why Sumer succeeded. That's why civilization emerged there. Not because they were uniquely innovative, but because they were uniquely positioned to remember, to preserve, to restore. They were the right people, in the right place, at the right time, with the right knowledge, and they finally had the resources and stability to use it. Sumer wasn't the first civilization. It was the restored civilization, the phoenix rising from ashes that had smoldered for 6,000 years. The light rekindled after a long darkness, and they knew it. That's why they wrote restoration of what was before. That's why they said kingship descended from heaven. That's why they obsessively copied old texts and maintained ancient traditions, because they understood themselves correctly. They weren't pioneers. They were conservators, maintainers, the keepers of flame, the restorers of what had been lost when the waters rose and the old world drowned. They succeeded because they remembered, and because 6,000 years of trauma and struggle and determination finally paid off. The knowledge survived, the memory held, and civilization returned. Chapter 7. The evidence emerging now. Here's what makes this theory more than speculation. We're starting to find evidence, physical evidence, underwater, exactly where this theory predicts it should be. Off the coast of India, near the city of Dwarka, divers have found structures, walls made of large stone blocks, foundations suggesting organized construction, artifacts including pottery and what appear to be tools or decorative objects. The depth suggests these structures were built when sea levels were lower, much lower, which means they're old. Older than conventional timelines allow for significant civilization in that region. Carbon dating of organic materials found at the site gives dates around 9,000 years ago. Some samples even older. This is thousands of years before the Indus Valley civilization is supposed to have begun. Thousands of years before India is supposed to have had cities. Yet there are structures, underwater, where land used to be. Near Yonaguni Island in Japan, underwater formations have puzzled researchers for decades. Massive stone structures with flat surfaces, right angles, what appear to be steps or terraces, passages that look carved. Natural erosion can create interesting shapes. Geological processes can produce patterns that seem artificial. But these formations have features that are difficult to explain naturally. Tool marks. Some suggest deliberate modification of the stone. If they're natural, they're remarkable. If they're artificial, they're ancient. Built when that area was above water, before the seas rose. The debate continues. But the formations exist, underwater, in locations that were dry land when sea levels were lower. In the Mediterranean, sonar surveys have detected anomalies, geometric patterns on the seafloor, straight lines, right angles, concentrations of material in patterns that don't match natural sedimentation. Without excavation, we can't know what they are. But they're there, in areas that were coastal plains during the Ice Age, where humans would have lived, where cities might have stood. The Black Sea has definite evidence. When researchers explored the depths where the ancient coastline would have been, they found structures preserved remarkably well in the oxygen-poor deep water. Buildings, tools, evidence of human habitation. This matches the theory that the Black Sea flooded catastrophically, that it was a freshwater lake before the Mediterranean broke through, that coastal settlements were inundated suddenly, that the survivors fled, carrying memories that became flood myths. And the Persian Gulf, the location this theory suggests was the center of the pre-flood civilization. It remains largely unexplored. The political situation has prevented comprehensive underwater archaeology. The depth makes it challenging. The sediment accumulation makes detection difficult. But preliminary sonar surveys have found anomalies, patterns that might be geological, or might be something else. Without investigation, we can't know. But they're there, waiting. Under 300 feet of water, under 12,000 years of sediment, in exactly the location where a river valley civilization would have thrived during the Ice Age. This is the frustrating part. The evidence might exist, right where the theory predicts, but we can't get to it, can't excavate properly, can't investigate thoroughly. The technology is barely adequate. The funding isn't there. The political will doesn't exist. So the structures sit, waiting, possibly revealing nothing, possibly revealing everything. We won't know until we look. But the fact that we're finding anything at all, that underwater archaeology is discovering structures in locations that were above water during the Ice Age, that the dates keep pushing back earlier than expected, that the sophistication keeps surprising researchers. This suggests something. It suggests that the conventional timeline might be incomplete, that there might be more to discover, that the coastlines now underwater might hold secrets we haven't imagined. The genetic evidence tells its own story, and it's a story of catastrophe, of massive population decline, of humanity coming close to extinction. When geneticists analyze human DNA, looking at mutation rates and genetic diversity, they can estimate historical population sizes. They can see when populations were large, when they were small, when genetic diversity increased or decreased, and they see something remarkable around 12,000 years ago. A bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in human population. Genetic diversity drops sharply. The number of distinct lineages decreases. This indicates that the human population crashed. Significantly, the estimates vary, but some suggest the global human population fell to perhaps 10,000 individuals, maybe fewer, a number so small that extinction was a real possibility. This bottleneck coincides with the end of the Younger Dryas, with the catastrophic climate change, with the rapid sea level rise, with exactly the period when the flood myths say the world was destroyed. The genetic evidence supports the stories. Something happened, something that killed most humans. That reduced our species to a remnant. That created a population crash from which it took thousands of years to recover. This isn't speculation. This is data, hard data from multiple independent research groups. The bottleneck exists. The crash happened, right when the myths say it happened. And after the bottleneck, genetic diversity begins increasing again. Slowly, populations recover, expand, diversify. But it takes time. Thousands of years, matching the 6,000-year gap between catastrophe and the emergence of Sumer. The genetics also show population movements. Migrations. During and after the bottleneck period, populations shifting, moving inland, away from coasts, concentrating in certain regions. This matches what we'd expect from rising seas. From coastal populations fleeing, from refugees relocating to higher ground, from the survivors clustering in areas where resources were still available. The genetic map of human migration shows pulses, waves of movement, not steady diffusion, but sudden dispersals, as if something forced people to move, as if their original locations became uninhabitable. And one of the concentration areas, one of the places where genetic diversity suggests populations clustered and recovered, is the Middle East, Mesopotamia specifically, where Sumer would eventually emerge. The genetics tell us that humans almost died out 12,000 years ago, that something catastrophic happened, that populations crashed and then slowly recovered, that survivors concentrated in certain regions, And that one of those regions was exactly where the first post-catastrophe civilization appeared. This is consilience. Different types of evidence pointing to the same conclusion. Geology says there was a catastrophe. Mythology says there was a catastrophe. And genetics says there was a catastrophe. At the same time, with the same effects, in the same locations. When multiple independent lines of evidence converge like this, you start to suspect they're describing something real. Something that actually happened. Not myth, not coincidence, history. The geology is perhaps the most solid evidence. Because rocks don't lie. Sediment layers don't forget. The earth keeps records that can't be altered by human memory or cultural interpretation. And the geological record is clear. Something catastrophic happened at the end of the Younger Dryas. Multiple somethings. A convergence of disasters that remade the world. Impact evidence. A layer of sediment dating to 12,800 years ago contains materials that indicate extraterrestrial impact. Nanodiamonds that only form under extreme pressure. Platinum concentrations far above normal background levels. Magnetic spherules suggesting intense heat. Carbon spherules indicating massive wildfires. This layer has been found across North America, in Europe, in Asia, a global signature, marking a moment when something from space hit Earth. Not one impact, but multiple. Fragments of a comet or asteroid breaking up and striking across a wide area. The ice cores tell the same story. When you drill into the Greenland ice sheet and extract cores going back thousands of years, you can read climate history in the ice. Each layer represents 1 year's snowfall. Chemical signatures indicate temperature, atmospheric composition, particulate content. At 12,800 years ago, the cores show a sharp change. Temperature drops suddenly. Particulate matter increases dramatically. Chemical signatures indicate massive fires. The atmosphere was filled with smoke and dust. Then, 1,200 years later, another sharp change. Temperature spikes upward, faster than at any other point in the record. The rapid warming that ended the Younger Dryas and triggered the final catastrophic melting. Ocean sediment cores show the same pattern. Layers indicating sudden influx of fresh water. Disruption of normal sedimentation patterns. Evidence of rapid sea level rise. Multiple pulses of meltwater entering the oceans over short time periods. Terrestrial evidence shows massive flooding. Scablands carved by catastrophic water flows. Deposits of displaced material hundreds of miles from origin points. Evidence of ice dams breaking and releasing lake-sized bodies of water in devastating floods. These weren't normal floods. These were biblical floods. World-altering floods. The kind that would destroy anything in their path. That would drown coastal settlements. That would force populations to flee or die. And extinction data. The end of the Younger Dryas coincides with mass extinctions. The megafauna die off. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats. Across multiple continents, all going extinct within a narrow time window. Climate change was part of it. But the rapidity suggests something more. Something sudden. Something that disrupted ecosystems so thoroughly that large animals couldn't adapt. If it was hard for mammoths, imagine how hard it was for humans. We survived. But barely. The genetic bottleneck proves it. Most humans died. Most human groups went extinct. Only a few populations in favorable locations pulled through, and those survivors faced a transformed world. Coastlines relocated hundreds of feet higher. River systems disrupted. Climate unstable. Entire landscapes drowned or burned or frozen. This is the world the Sumerians' ancestors survived. This is the catastrophe their myths remember. This is the flood that destroyed the old world and forced humanity to start over. The geology confirms it. Not through interpretation, through direct physical evidence, through layers of rock and ice that record what happened, through markers that can be dated, through signatures that indicate impact, fire, flooding, and rapid change. This wasn't myth. This was reality. The earth itself bears the scars, and those scars match what the ancient stories describe. A world destroyed by fire and water and upheaval, forcing the survivors to flee, to preserve what they could, to wait for the world to stabilize again. And when it did stabilize, 6,000 years later, those survivors' descendants remembered enough to rebuild, to restore, to create Sumer, not as a new beginning, but as a continuation, a restoration of what had existed before the catastrophe. Before the world ended, before the flood, before the sky fell and the earth burned and the waters rose to cover everything humanity had built. Chapter 8. What it means. So what does all of this mean? If this theory is correct, if there really was an advanced civilization before Sumer, if the flood really happened, if the survivors really preserved knowledge across 6,000 years, what does that change? Everything. It changes everything about how we understand ourselves, our history, our place in time. We're not pioneers. We're not the first humans to build cities, to develop writing, to create complex societies. We're not blazing a trail. We're walking a path that's been walked before. This is humbling. We like to think we're special, that our civilization is unique, that we're the peak of human achievement, that everything before us was primitive, simple, less than what we've become. But what if we're not the peak? What if we're just another iteration, another cycle in a pattern that's repeated before? What if everything we've accomplished, everything we're proud of, has been done already? By people whose names we don't know, whose cities are underwater, whose achievements we've forgotten. That changes the narrative. We're not climbing towards something new. We're climbing back towards something that existed before. We're recovering, rebuilding, restoring what was lost when the world ended 12,000 years ago. The Sumerians understood this. That's why they didn't celebrate invention. They celebrated preservation. They honored the ancestors. They tried to maintain what had been given to them, because they knew they weren't creating. They were continuing. We've lost that perspective. We think history is linear, primitive past, advanced present, even more advanced future, a straight line going up forever. But what if it's not a line? What if it's a cycle? What if civilizations rise and fall and rise again? What if we've been here before? What if the real story of humanity is not progress, but repetition? Learning and forgetting, and learning again. That's a different story. A more complex story. A story that doesn't make us the heroes, just the latest chapter in a much longer book, and it raises uncomfortable questions. If they fell, if that advanced pre-flood civilization collapsed despite their knowledge, despite their sophistication, despite everything they built, what makes us think we won't fall too? If it happened before, it can happen again. Catastrophe doesn't care about technology, doesn't respect advancement. The Earth has its own rhythms, its own cycles, and human civilization, no matter how impressive we think it is, exists within those larger patterns. We're not in control. We're participants, players in a game that's been running for much longer than we realized. And if we don't understand the rules, if we don't learn from what happened before, we might repeat the same mistakes. The pre-flood civilization, whatever it was, didn't survive. It was destroyed, erased so completely that we're only now beginning to suspect it existed. What destroyed it? The comet impacts, the climate change, the rising seas, things they couldn't control. Natural disasters on a scale that overwhelmed their capability to respond. But maybe there were other factors. Maybe they contributed to their own vulnerability. Maybe they damaged their environment. Maybe they depleted their resources. Maybe they created internal instability that made them unable to adapt when the external catastrophe came. We don't know. Can't know without more evidence. But the question hangs there. What killed them? And are we doing the same things? There's another lesson here, about preservation, about how we store knowledge, about what survives catastrophe and what doesn't. The pre-flood civilization, if it existed, presumably had ways of recording information, of storing knowledge. But whatever methods they used, they didn't survive, or survived so poorly that we can't find them, can't read them, can't recover the knowledge, except for what was preserved in human memory, in oral tradition, in the stories and rituals that the survivors maintained. That's what made it through. Not their databases, not their libraries, not their sophisticated storage systems, just human memory. passed down generation after generation. The Sumerians learned from this. They wrote on clay. Humble clay. Not impressive. Not high-tech. Just mud pressed with reeds. And it worked. 5,000 years later, we can still read their tablets, still recover their knowledge, still hear their voices. Because clay lasts. Clay is stable. Clay survives. Now consider our civilization. How do we store knowledge? Hard drives, servers, cloud storage, digital formats that require electricity, that require functioning infrastructure, that require compatible hardware and software to read. How long will these last? 50 years. 100. The oldest digital storage we have is already becoming inaccessible. File formats obsolete. Hardware incompatible. The data exists, but we can't read it. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow, if something catastrophic happened, what would survive? What would future archaeologists find? Physical books, maybe. For a while, until they decay. Until moisture and insects and time destroy them. A few centuries at most. Stone monuments. Those would last. But we don't write our knowledge on stone anymore. We write it digitally. Ephemeral. Fragile. Dependent on systems that would fail immediately if civilization collapsed. The Sumerians' clay tablets are more durable than our hard drives. Their primitive technology will outlast our advanced technology, because they built for permanence, and we've built for convenience. This is backwards. We think we're more advanced. But in terms of preservation, in terms of ensuring knowledge survives, we're worse. Much worse. If catastrophe comes, if our civilization falls the way the pre-flood civilization fell, what will we leave behind? What will the survivors have to work with? Ruins. Plastic trash. Concrete foundations. But our knowledge, our accumulated understanding, our technology, it might all be lost. Inaccessible. Locked in formats that can't be read without infrastructure that no longer exists. The survivors would have to start over. From almost nothing. Just like the survivors 12,000 years ago. Maintaining what they could in oral tradition. Waiting for conditions to improve enough to rebuild. To restore. And maybe 6,000 years later, they'd succeed. They'd create a new civilization. And they'd find our ruins. Our plastic. Our concrete. And they'd wonder what we were. What we knew. What happened to us. But they wouldn't be able to read our hard drives. Wouldn't have compatible computers. Wouldn't understand our file formats. All our digitally stored knowledge would be as inaccessible as the pre-flood civilization's knowledge is to us. This should worry us. Should make us think about preservation differently. Should make us consider creating knowledge storage that doesn't depend on electricity, on functioning global infrastructure, on technological compatibility. The Sumerians solved this problem 5,000 years ago. They wrote on clay. Maybe we should too. And then there's the biggest implication. The one that keeps me awake at night. If this has happened before, if civilizations have risen and fallen in cycles, if catastrophe has destroyed advanced cultures and forced humanity to rebuild from fragments, what's to stop it from happening again? To us? Now, in our lifetime or our children's lifetime, we're not immune. We're not special. The Earth doesn't care about our technology, doesn't respect our accomplishments. The same forces that destroyed the pre-flood civilization can destroy us. Comet impacts still happen. Not often, but they happen. The Earth passes through debris fields. Objects from space cross our orbit. Most are small. Some are large. We've been lucky so far. But luck runs out. Climate change is real. We're causing it this time. Through our own actions. Through carbon emissions and ecosystem destruction. But the result might be similar. Rapid change. Rising seas. Disrupted weather patterns. Agricultural collapse. Mass migration. Conflict over resources. The pre-flood civilization didn't cause their catastrophe. It came from outside. From space. From natural cycles they couldn't control. But the result was the same. Coastal cities drowned. Populations crashed. Knowledge lost. Civilization destroyed. We might cause our own catastrophe. Through short-sightedness. Through prioritizing short-term gain over long-term survival. through damaging the systems we depend on. And the result might be the same. Cities drowned, populations crashed, knowledge lost, civilization destroyed. We have advantages they didn't have. We understand more about how the Earth works. We can see threats coming. We have global communication, potential for coordinated response, technology that might help us adapt or mitigate. But we also have disadvantages. Our population is much larger. 8 billion people instead of a few million. Our systems are more complex, more interconnected, more fragile. We depend on global supply chains, on electrical grids, on systems that can fail catastrophically. And we're not unified, not coordinated. We're divided into competing nations, different languages, different priorities, different levels of capability. When crisis comes, will we work together? Or will we fragment, compete, fight over what's left? The pre-flood survivors managed to preserve some knowledge, enough that 6,000 years later, their descendants could rebuild, could restore civilization, could create Sumer. If our civilization falls, will we manage the same? Will we preserve enough? Will our survivors maintain oral traditions? Will they remember how things worked? Will they keep alive the knowledge needed to rebuild? Or will we lose everything? Will the complexity of our systems mean nothing survives? Will specialization mean nobody understands the full picture? Will our dependence on technology mean that when the technology fails, we can't function? These are real questions, not hypothetical, not abstract. Real questions about real risks that our civilization faces. The cycle has repeated before. We're just now beginning to understand that, beginning to see evidence of what came before us, of what was lost, of what had to be rebuilt. And we need to ask ourselves, are we preparing for the possibility that it might repeat again? Are we building resilience? Are we preserving knowledge in forms that can survive catastrophe? Are we creating systems that can adapt, that can continue even if central infrastructure fails? Or are we just hoping it won't happen to us, assuming that because we're advanced, we're safe, that our technology will protect us, that the cycle won't repeat? Because if we're making that assumption, we might be wrong, catastrophically wrong, the same way the pre-flood civilization was wrong, the ones who thought their world was permanent, who thought their cities would last forever, who didn't imagine that the seas would rise and swallow everything they'd built. Their world ended. Ours might too. The cycle doesn't stop just because we don't believe in it. Chapter 9. The Whisper from Below. 300 feet below the surface of the Persian Gulf, under layers of sediment that have accumulated for 12,000 years, something waits. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe the river valley that existed there during the Ice Age held only scattered villages, simple settlements, hunter-gatherer camps with no more sophistication than sites we've already found. But maybe it's something else. Maybe down there, preserved in the oxygen-poor sediment, protected from erosion by the weight of water and time, lie the ruins of the civilization that came before, the one the Sumerians were trying to remember. Cities built when the valley was dry, when the Tigris and Euphrates joined and flowed through what is now underwater, when coastlines were different, when the geography favored concentration, settlement, development. If they're there, they're waiting. The foundations of temples, the remains of irrigation systems, the fragments of whatever they used to record information, the artifacts that would prove this theory, that would show definitively that something existed before Sumer, something advanced, something that was destroyed when the seas rose. We can't get to them. Not yet. The technology for deep-water archaeology exists, but it's expensive, difficult, requires sustained effort and significant funding. And the political situation in the region makes comprehensive surveys challenging. But someday, maybe in our lifetimes, maybe in our children's, someone will explore those depths thoroughly. We'll map the ancient river valley. We'll find what's buried there. And either the theory will be confirmed, or it will be disproven. Either we'll find evidence of advanced pre-flood civilization, or we'll find that the valley held nothing unusual, that the Sumerians really were the first. That civilization really did begin where we think it began. I suspect we'll find something. The patterns are too consistent, the evidence too suggestive, the convergence of mythology, genetics, geology, and archaeology too compelling. But I could be wrong. That's the nature of theories. They're provisional, subject to evidence, meant to be tested, and if the evidence contradicts them, they need to be abandoned. So the question remains open, waiting for someone to answer it definitively, waiting for the underwater excavations that might finally resolve what happened. Whether something existed before, whether the survivors really did preserve knowledge from a drowned world. The Persian Gulf keeps its secrets, for now, but secrets don't stay buried forever. Eventually, someone digs deep enough, looks carefully enough, and the truth, whatever it is, comes to light. But there's a darker possibility, one that's harder to accept. That's more disturbing than the idea of one lost civilization. What if this has happened more than once? What if the cycle has repeated multiple times? What if human civilization has risen and fallen not twice but many times? What if we're not recovering from one catastrophe but from many? What if every 10,000 years or so something happens? A comet, a supervolcano, rapid climate shift, some catastrophic event that destroys whatever civilization exists. That kills most people. That erases most evidence. That forces the survivors to start over. And what if this has been happening for much longer than 12,000 years? What if there were civilizations 50,000 years ago? 100,000? That rose and fell and left no trace except perhaps some anomalous artifacts we can't explain. Some out-of-place technology that doesn't fit our timeline. We wouldn't know. The evidence would be too degraded, too deeply buried, too transformed by time and geology. We'd find hints, anomalies, things that don't quite fit, but nothing definitive, nothing we could prove. And maybe that's the real pattern. Humanity builds, achieves, creates civilization, and then catastrophe comes. Not always the same catastrophe, not on a predictable schedule, but regularly enough that civilization never lasts, never becomes permanent, never escapes the cycle. We rise, we fall. The survivors preserve what they can, wait for conditions to improve, eventually rebuild, rise again, and the cycle continues. If that's true, then we're not unique. We're not special. We're just the current iteration, the latest version of humanity trying to become civilized, unaware that we've done this before, multiple times, always losing, always forgetting, always having to start over. The ancient myths hint at this. Stories of multiple ages, multiple creations, multiple destructions. The Hindu yugas, the Mayan cycles, the Greek ages of man, all describing the same pattern, the world destroyed and remade, humanity rising and falling, over and over. We've dismissed these as mythology, as attempts to explain natural cycles through storytelling. But what if they're memories? Distorted, mythologized, but ultimately based on truth, on the pattern that actually exists. Rise, fall, forget, begin again. If that's the pattern, then knowledge of the pattern itself might be the most important knowledge. Understanding that this happens, that it can happen, that it will happen again, that our responsibility is not just to advance but to preserve, to build in ways that might survive, to store knowledge in forms that might last, to prepare for the possibility that everything we build might be destroyed, and to hope that the survivors, whoever they are, can rebuild faster than we did, can preserve more than we preserved, can break the cycle, or at least shorten it, learn to survive catastrophe better, recover faster, lose less, because if the cycle is real, if it continues, then that's all we can do. Build, preserve, hope, and accept that we're part of something much larger and longer than our individual civilizations. Part of humanity's long struggle to become permanently civilized, a struggle that hasn't succeeded yet, but maybe someday will. So here we are, at the end of this investigation, after examining the evidence, after considering the theories, after looking at what the Sumerians said about themselves, what the myths say, what the geology says, what the genetics say. And the real question isn't just, Was there something before Sumer? That's interesting. That's important. That would change how we understand history. But the deeper question is, what does it mean for us? If this has happened before, what are the implications? What should we do differently? How should we think about our own civilization, our own vulnerability, our own responsibility to the future? Because if there was a pre-flood civilization, they didn't expect to die, didn't plan for catastrophe, didn't prepare for the possibility that their world would end. They built as if it would last forever. And it didn't. Are we making the same mistake? Building as if our civilization is permanent. As if catastrophe can't happen. As if the cycles that destroyed previous civilizations don't apply to us. The evidence suggests we should be less confident, more humble, more aware of how fragile civilization is, how quickly it can fall, how thoroughly it can be erased. And maybe we should be thinking more seriously about preservation, about resilience, about building systems that can survive disruption, about storing knowledge in ways that don't depend on functioning infrastructure, about preparing for possibilities we don't want to think about. The Sumerians tried to preserve. They wrote on clay. They copied old texts. They maintained traditions. They understood that knowledge could be lost. That forgetting was a real danger. We've forgotten that. We assume our digital storage is permanent, that our knowledge is safe, that we'll always have access to what we've recorded. But we might not. If catastrophe comes, if our systems fail, if our civilization falls, most of what we know might be lost. And the survivors would face the same challenge the post-flood survivors faced. Trying to remember, trying to preserve fragments, trying to keep alive enough knowledge to eventually rebuild. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not whether there was something before Sumer, but that forgetting is real. Loss is real. Catastrophe is real. And our responsibility is not just to advance, but to ensure that advancement can survive us, can outlast our particular civilization, can benefit whoever comes after, whether that's our direct descendants or distant successors. After a collapse, we don't survive. Chapter 10. Closing Reflection. The Sumerians had a perspective we've lost. They looked backward. They believed the golden age was behind them. That wisdom existed in the past. That their role was to preserve, to maintain, to restore what the ancestors knew. We look forward. We believe progress is inevitable, that each generation knows more than the last, that the future will be better than the present. That wisdom accumulates, that we're always improving. But what if the Sumerians were right? What if the peak really is behind us? What if the pre-flood civilization achieved things we haven't achieved? Knew things we don't know? Built things we couldn't build? We'll probably never know for certain. The evidence is too fragmentary, too deeply buried, too thoroughly erased by 12,000 years of geological processes. But the possibility should make us think, should make us question our assumptions, should make us wonder whether our forward-looking perspective is as accurate as we think. Maybe progress isn't linear. Maybe it's not guaranteed. Maybe advancement and regression are both possible. Maybe we can lose as well as gain, forget as well as learn. The Sumerians understood this. They were afraid of forgetting, obsessed with preservation, determined to maintain what had been given to them, because they knew knowledge could be lost, had been lost, was in danger of being lost again. Their fear was justified. Their language died. Their culture was absorbed. Their knowledge was scattered. If they hadn't written everything on clay, we wouldn't know they existed, wouldn't know what they accomplished, wouldn't hear their voices. But they did write it down, and the clay survived. And now, 5,000 years later, we can read what they wrote, can understand what they preserved, can appreciate what they were trying to do. They were looking backward, trying to remember, and inadvertently, they created memory for us, for the future they couldn't imagine, for people who would come thousands of years after them. For us, maybe that's the real achievement. Not what they built, not what they invented, but what they preserved, what they passed on, the knowledge that survived them. Tonight, somewhere in a museum basement, a clay tablet sits in darkness, covered in cuneiform marks pressed 5,000 years ago. Still readable, still carrying meaning, still whispering to anyone patient enough to listen. The tablet might describe a grain delivery, a legal dispute, an astronomical observation, something mundane, something the scribe thought was important enough to record, but probably didn't think was profound. But the profound part isn't what the tablet says. It's that it exists at all, that it survived, that someone 5,000 years ago pressed marks into wet clay, and those marks are still there, still legible, still transmitting thought across an impossible gulf of time. That's the miracle. Not supernatural, just the miracle of preservation, of durability, of clay and intention and the human need to be remembered. The tablet's message isn't we were first. The message is we were what remained. We preserved. We maintained. We refused to forget. And because we refused, you know we existed. You know what we knew. You know we were here. That message comes through. Across 5,000 years. Across the death of their language. Across the collapse of their civilization. The clay still whispers. Memory still speaks. And maybe that's the message for us too. Maybe our responsibility isn't just to advance, isn't just to build bigger, faster, more sophisticated systems. Maybe our responsibility is to preserve, to ensure that what we learn, what we discover, what we achieve doesn't die with us. To write on clay, metaphorically, if not literally, to store knowledge in ways that can survive catastrophe. To build memory that outlasts our civilization. To be, like the Sumerians, what remains, what persists, what speaks to the future even after we're gone. Because if the cycle continues, if catastrophe comes, if our civilization falls the way previous civilizations fell, then what we preserve might be all that saves the survivors, all that allows them to rebuild, all that lets them avoid starting completely from zero. The Sumerians gave that gift to us. Knowledge preserved, memory maintained, whispers from the past that guided the future. Maybe we should do the same. So what do you believe? After everything we've explored tonight, after examining the evidence, after considering the theories, what makes sense to you? The mainstream view is that Sumer was first. That civilization began there. That the sophistication we see is the result of gradual development. That the gaps in the archaeological record are just gaps. That the earlier evidence exists, but we haven't found it yet. This is entirely possible. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Maybe we just need to dig deeper, look harder, wait for more discoveries, and eventually the missing pieces will appear. The progression will make sense. The timeline will fill in. Or maybe there was something before. A civilization that existed on coastlines now underwater. That developed sophistication over thousands of years. That was destroyed in the catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age. That left survivors who preserved knowledge, who maintained traditions, who eventually, after 6,000 years of recovery, restored what had been lost. Maybe the Sumerians were right about themselves. They were rebuilders, restorers, the inheritors of older wisdom. Not the first, but the rememberers. Not pioneers, but conservators. Not inventing, but preserving. Both explanations fit some of the evidence. Neither fits all of it. The truth might be somewhere between, or might be something we haven't imagined yet, or might remain forever uncertain, buried too deep to recover. But the investigation matters. The questions matter. The willingness to consider possibilities outside conventional timelines matters, because that's how understanding advances. By questioning, by looking at evidence from different angles, by entertaining theories that might be wrong, but might reveal something important even in being wrong. The Sumerians left us mysteries, deliberately or inadvertently. The impossible king lists, the sophisticated knowledge appearing suddenly, the insistence on restoration rather than creation, the global flood myths, the genetic bottleneck, the geological evidence of catastrophe. These mysteries don't have definitive answers yet, but they point somewhere, suggest something, invite us to reconsider what we think we know about human history, about how far back civilization might go, about whether we're the first to try this or just the latest. Stay curious, stay questioning, stay open to evidence, even when it challenges what you've been taught. That's the only way we learn, the only way we grow, the only way we might eventually understand what really happened, who we really are, where we really came from. The clay tablets are still whispering. Are you listening? So here's what I want to know. After this journey through time and catastrophe and mystery, after considering the evidence, after thinking about what it means, which explanation resonates with you? Do you think Sumer was truly the first? That civilization began there with no precedent? Or do you think there was something before? Something that drowned when the seas rose? Something the Sumerians were trying to remember? Drop a comment. Tell me what you think. Not just your conclusion, but why. What evidence convinced you? What questions remain? What would you need to see to change your mind? This isn't about being right. It's about exploring possibilities, about thinking critically, about engaging with evidence, about being willing to question what we've been taught. And if you enjoyed this investigation, if this kind of deep dive into history's mysteries speaks to you, subscribe. There are more stories like this, more forgotten chapters, more questions that don't have easy answers, more evidence that suggests our past is stranger and deeper than we've imagined. We're all trying to understand where we came from, what happened before, what it means for where we're going. We're in this together. The story isn't finished. New evidence emerges constantly. Underwater archaeology advances. AI translates more tablets. Genetic analysis gets more precise. Geological surveys find new anomalies. Every year, we know more than we did the year before. Every decade, the picture gets clearer, or sometimes more complex. Sometimes new evidence confirms theories. Sometimes it contradicts them. That's how science works, how understanding evolves. The Persian Gulf still waits, 300 feet down, under 12,000 years of sediment, holding whatever secrets it holds. Someday, someone will explore it thoroughly. We'll map the ancient river valley. We'll find what's there or confirm that nothing's there. And either way, we'll know more than we know now. We'll have answers to questions that are currently speculation. We'll understand better what happened, what existed, what was lost. Until then, we investigate. We question. We examine evidence. We consider possibilities. We stay curious. Sleep well tonight. Dream of drowned cities, of knowledge preserved against impossible odds, of survivors who refuse to forget, of clay tablets whispering across 5,000 years. Dream of cycles, of civilizations rising and falling, of patterns that repeat, of humanity's long struggle to become permanently civilized. A struggle that continues, that we're part of, that isn't finished. And remember this: memory doesn't die. It transforms. It waits. It resurfaces when someone is ready to listen. The Sumerians are still speaking. Through their clay, through their myths, through the foundations they built that we still stand on, through the questions they left unanswered. And maybe, somewhere beneath the Persian Gulf, in ruins we haven't found yet, in structures that might not even exist, there are more voices, older voices, waiting to be heard. The investigation continues. The mystery remains. The whisper from below still calls. Are you listening? Good night.